So let me whip out some armchair evolution here, even though I
armchair evolution.
Welcome to Needlessly Complicated, your safe space for hopefully almost rational outlook on life.
Good evening, Yasha. A new week, a new podcast episode. How are you doing today?
Good evening, Felix. I'm doing pretty well, considering how well our last podcast episode went, where we had the first interview and Kushal was here with us talking about issues with migration and issues in India, and big thanks to him for being here because it was a great episode and it was very well received.
And if you guys want to check out more of his stuff, I have word that he's working on his own show/YouTube channel. And it's not up yet, but if you keep an eye on YouTube and search for The Dharmic Skeptic, and Dharmic is DHARMIC, then you'll probably be able to find it soon, and I might even appear on that. And then other news about friends of the podcast, Adam from Sweden, who was also on the Ruben Report fan show, and a friend of his, Andrew, are starting their own little podcast, which is called Meanwhile in Sweden, and they will rant about recent developments in Sweden, and I've been told that it might turn out similar to the Joe Rogan podcast, so definitely check them out as well.
Right, and on that note, we are also happy to announce that we are approaching 1,000 downloads, and it's just awesome that so many people listen to our podcast, so thanks everybody for tuning in.
Yeah, a big thanks for everybody who's tuning in out from me as well. And if you want to help us grow the podcast and get more interesting people on and generally improve everything that's around the podcast, then go ahead and contact us, give us some feedback, make suggestions. Somebody said on our subreddit that he would like the episodes to air on YouTube as well. We have done that. You can find us there under Needlessly Complicated as well. And one of the biggest ways you can help us out is to subscribe through iTunes and leave us a review there, or go to our Facebook page and like us there. And to make the whole experience better and easier for new listeners, we are also having some major changes to the website, so don't be surprised if something changes there in the coming weeks. Yasha, this week we got another guest on, and it's a fellow Ruben reporter as well, and it's the one who triggered at least 1,000 feminists. It's Sophie from London, and she is an advocate of science and evidence-based lifestyles. She's a professional model, she's a certified PT and nutritional coach, and she recently graduated with a degree in Portuguese as well.
Nice. Welcome to the show, Sophie.
Hi guys, thank you so much for having me on.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
So Sophie, you graduated among all the things you already have done in Portuguese, right?
In Portuguese and in Spanish, yeah. I couldn't resist just doing one. I had to do two.
That's awesome. How many languages do you speak, or is it only that and English?
So I speak English, Spanish, Portuguese, and I did French up to A-level. And I would really like to continue improving my French to get it up to the level of fluency that I am currently at with Spanish and Portuguese, because it's a beautiful language. I have a thing for Romance languages, as you can see. I find them interesting because of their Latin base. And I would really like to learn more about it. I've actually learned a bit of German, but I stopped it after GCSE, which I do regret. I do want to learn more. I want to learn quite a few languages. I love languages. They're a huge passion of mine.
I mean, German is not very romantic, is it?
Well, no, but it's a different style of language and a different form of syntax, and that interests me. I look at a language, for me, obviously some people will think, oh, X language doesn't sound as nice, or this language sounds nicer, or this language is really hard. because I have kind of a linguistics way of looking at things, I'll look at a language and think, oh, that's really fascinating how I put the verb there and the noun there. And it's really, really interesting. And so I want to branch out. As much as I love Romance languages and I really want to learn Italian, when I was working in Milan like a year ago or so, I picked it up like that because it's almost a conglomerate of Spanish and Portuguese, so it was really easy to pick up. But I would really want to branch out away from Romance languages. Like I would really, really love to learn Mandarin or maybe even Russian or German again, because it's so fascinating to see how different languages are spoken and how they've changed according to their history or their culture, or how people's societies have changed and grown in that country or in that area of land.
So I guess the obvious question here is that the only reason you got into studying languages, or was there any event or any hobby that was kind of prior to that led you down that path?
I think it was a mixture of things. I think with languages, I'm very much, I think my brain is very much verbally attuned in the sense that I love literature. I love reading. I love words. They pop in my head much, much easier than say numbers do. And that's not to say I don't really appreciate maths and the sciences. Obviously I adore them. And I live a very secular, science-based, rational-based life. But for me, I really connect well with reading and understanding words and understanding sentences and the richness that a language can bring in, especially when I'm reading a book, say. And I've always been fascinated with the idea that a language can communicate one concept that is universally understood, but in so many different ways. And since doing French from a young age, because at our school we were taught from a very young age, even if it was very, very basic French, we were taught that from a very young age. And then as that developed, I picked up German and I dropped that because I wanted to do Spanish instead. And I learned that. And then I picked up Portuguese because I was fascinated by the link between Spanish and Portuguese culture and the language and the differences between them linguistically and syntactically. And for me, it comes down to the idea of communicating ideas, communicating cultures, there's actually some studies that show some people have different personalities according to how they, to which language they speak. So for instance, my friend tends to be a lot more gregarious and boisterous when she speaks Spanish than she is in English. It's really interesting and I've noticed it. And connections like that, little indications that a language can convey certain things that another language might not convey or convey in a different way has always fascinated me. And also the idea of where language comes from and how we as humans have learnt to communicate and the history of how a language has been brought up and created. And Steven Pinker and Noam Chomsky, I know Noam Chomsky is quite controversial in academia right now because of his somewhat regressive foreign policy views. But in terms of linguistics, I think Noam Chomsky is excellent. I mean, he was the one that really brought me into the study of languages and got me really interested into what it meant to study the very foundations of what it means to speak a language.
That's fascinating. But you've mentioned that you're like advocating science and logic and stuff like that, but that's pretty intertwined with languages, isn't it?
Yep.
You could do you actually study or have you studied linguistics and science behind that?
Yeah, I've done a couple during, obviously I was studying Spanish and Portuguese, and you have the option in a language degree to focus on history or culture or literature based modules. Now I did the bulk of mine in literature and history as an accompaniment to my main grammar and speaking and basically becoming fluent in the languages sort of sector. But I've done linguistics modules in the past and it's really fascinating. It's hard work, but it is fascinating. And you really, really appreciate that a language, the construction of a sentence, there's almost a mathematical feel to it because there is an order. There is something that, as soon as you speak a sentence, that syntax or whatever you might be saying will either make complete sense to a native speaker or it might sound like gobbledygook. And, the funny thing is one word or one placement of a word makes that difference and bridges that difference between, fluency and eloquence and complete garbage. And I find that fascinating. And I think, like you say, there is a very evident connection between logic and reason and rationality, and perhaps even a science behind it, and linguistics and language. For sure. I definitely agree with that.
So you mentioned you want to learn many more languages, but would you be interested in pursuing the science behind it as a career, or is that not something you would want to do?
Maybe not as a career, just because I don't know if I have the required skill set, or if I'm even good enough. But as an interest, yes, for sure. I think it's something that's always going to interest me for the rest of my life. I mean, even just looking at, for instance, the fact that some languages have certain words and certain phrases that other languages don't, is something that boggles my mind, because that, for me, that indicates something that a society or group of people have developed their own ideas on communication, or developed their own ideas on how they perceive the world. And they've created a word for that. Whereas other clans, other humans, other tribes even, if you're going down a Darwinian route, would see something completely differently, and therefore they wouldn't have that word in particular, or they wouldn't have that word at all. I'm thinking specifically in Portuguese, there is a word called saudade, and saudade is a beautiful, beautiful word, because it indicates something of great yearning, that you're missing something greatly. It can be something or somebody. And there is not an exact English translation. It's very crudely translated as to be missing or yearning something extremely strongly, something that was once great again. And saudade really created this philosophy during the 20th century in Portugal called saudosismo. And that was basically a way to try and reinvigorate Portugal, because it had declined economically, culturally, and socially. And this philosophy of saudosismo was looking back at the past, when Portugal was a great nation, when it was taking imports and exports, when it was essentially an empire and it was the strongest in Europe. And granted, this was 15th century, 16th century, but they were using the past to try and regain that. And this philosophy of saudosismo evoked this sense of yearning, and writers in the intelligentsia would write constantly trying to talk about how we can be Portuguese again, how we can make Portugal great again.
I was about to say
it was literally like that. And they were trying to find ways of how they can recreate this glory. And so the word saudade, even though it's such a simple word, it essentially means, missing you. If I say tenho saudades de ti, it basically means I miss you. But in a very, very strong sense. But that's basically the vaguest translation I can find in English. This word took on a whole new meaning in the 20th century because of the philosophy attached to it and the yearning to get back Portugal. So, there's that internet meme, Felix, I'm sure you've seen it, when it's the thing that says race and science, the social construct, but at the bottom it says words have meaning. There is actually, there's something quite powerful and quite poetic about the last line, because words really do have meaning. They have historical meaning. They were conjured up in a social, cultural time. And even in languages that have genders, I'm sure in German, this, the genders were assigned to nouns, in the definite articles based either on common sense or even historical times. And I find that fascinating. So our language, as much, I think Noam Chomsky talks about universal grammar and how that was innate and how language is essentially hardwired into the brain. And Steven Pinker talks about this as well. But I think in a way, there are some nuances to language that doesn't just come biologically. So, and I realized that when studying Portuguese, and how this little word saudade carries so much historical and social meaning that goes beyond evolutionary impulse. And, stuff like that fascinates me.
I mean, you could argue though that the impact this particular word has is an evolutionary kind of tribalistic one.
Sure.
Or at least it's connected to evolutionary principles. But this sounds very interesting. I always wondered, as a German speaker, I could never get behind the whole gender thing, to be honest, because it really seems arbitrary to me, but there might be a deeper concept behind it. But you've been talking about grammar a lot, and both Yasha and me are very interested in education, and you have learned many languages in school. But what do you think about how we teach children language?
That's a really, really good question. It's really interesting because, there's so many people that tell me, and it's almost like, when people say, oh, I'm so bad at science, or I'm so bad at maths, and they sort of laugh. It's the same for languages that, I always speak to someone, they say, I just can't learn a language, or no matter how much I've tried, I can't learn a language. Now, I disagree with this because in a sense, I'm harking back to Chomsky's universal grammar theory here, where language can essentially be hardwired into the brain. And I believe that when you tap into a certain way of learning, you really do click with learning a syntax, with learning a grammar, because ultimately that other language, even though it might seem alien at first, once you deconstruct it, God, I sound like a postmodernist here. I apologize.
Go ahead.
Once you dissect it, that's a better one. Once you dissect the meaning, once you learn the vocabulary, once you learn the grammar, once you understand like what that word equals that word, and when you put that equals that, your brain will start to click and it will start to sort of whir, like cogs whirring. It will start to move about like cogs whirring. And once you understand that sentence structure, your mind will then be able to sort of click and understand other sentence structures. And it's kind of like, sort of little spark that, ignites in your brain, I think, when it comes to learning languages. Now, when people are when children are learning languages, it's actually easier, when you're younger to learn a language because it's, I'm not too sure on the science about this, but you guys, I'm sure, will definitely fill me in here. But when you're younger, allegedly it's a lot easier for you to learn a language. And therefore, as you become older, it becomes harder to learn a new language from scratch. I'm not necessarily sure on the science behind it, but my theory is obviously your brain is slightly fresh and young, so it can take in new information and new ways of speaking and communicating a lot easier than it is when you're older and you're used to speaking one language. But there are studies that actually show this, and it's really, really interesting. So when you're younger, you tend to be more eager, you tend to take in a language a lot easier. And it's when you're older that it requires a bit more elbow grease, where you do need to actually make lists of vocabulary more, where you do need to find a way of learning that connects with you. But going back to your question on how we teach children languages, it's interesting because in the UK there is not a large emphasis on teaching languages, which I think is tragic. And so the teaching of languages is very subpar. Half the time you don't even get a native speaker, which I think, even though it might sound discriminatory not to hire a non-native speaker, I think at the same time you need at least one native speaker in a department or in a university faculty or so, because you don't know how the language is constantly changing, how, the language constantly picks up colloquialisms or how people prefer to speak in that way or that way. And if you're not a native speaker, sure, you might know how to learn a language in a textbook fashion, but you'll never really understand the ins and outs of the language. And I think, as much as someone can say, oh, I'm fluent in a language, I don't really say I'm fluent in Spanish, Portuguese, even though I'm up to, graduate level, because I think everyone is constantly learning even their own language. I don't know the entire contents of the English dictionary. I'm constantly learning new ways of speaking and reading in English and refining my speech in English. So in a way, none of us are even fluent fully in their own their own native language, just because some people might be more proficient in speaking or reading or writing than others. So I think the teaching is a hugely important aspect of teaching languages. And I think it should be done a lot better, at least in the UK. I've heard in Europe it seems to be a lot better and a lot more efficient, but I'm not sure. What's it like in Germany?
Well, in Germany, it's all right, I think, in terms of the quantity, especially if you do get in secondary school, you get a few languages that you can choose from usually. The options are not always that great. But usually you always get English. I think that starts in elementary school now, but I'm not quite sure on that. But you then have to learn a second language, and you can even specialize in languages and take a third one. And I'm not sure about Hungary. Yasha, how is it looking now?
Here in Hungary, it's usually people learn English or German for their secondary languages, and it's pretty rare to find people who don't speak a second language, because obviously with Hungarian, it's a very, about 10 to 12 million people speak it. So it's not a language that you can use universally. So you kind of have to, especially in Europe, you have to learn a second language. But I think it's a good thing because, as you mentioned, learning languages is actually it helps develop your personality, kinda. Sure. And so, second language is great, but, I wanted to ask you, how do you think, and I think, Felix alluded to this in his previous question, is, when we teach children, especially in formal education, is it the right approach that we use? Because what I found mostly that we teach in a very grammar-oriented way, very much about these, not even just grammar, but very system-oriented and these rules and exceptions. But children, for example, in natural learning environment, learn languages by mimicking their peers and their parents and trying to use it all the time.
I definitely have changed my mind about how one learns a language over time, having done my degree, because I think it is imperative if someone is learning another language that isn't their own. Now, obviously, sometimes it's not always possible, but I think if you really want to get full access to fluency of a language, I think it's almost compulsory to go at least and live in the country that speaks that language, or a country that speaks that language, for at least a couple of months at least. Reasons for this being, only like you say, you start to mimic their behavior. You start to get more confident, because even though you start off being extremely frightened and scared, being put in another country that isn't your own, that doesn't speak your language, you can start to acclimatize your body language to what you're trying to convey. People then understand you. People then feed back to you the appropriate word or sentence that you're trying to say. That is then stored in your brain a lot easier, because obviously if you're being gesticulating and how you're communicating, it's a kinetic form of learning. So you tend to take that in a lot easier than, say, just reading from a textbook. You also learn cultural norms, behavioral norms, general, even the intonations of people's voices. You don't pick that up from a textbook, or let alone a classroom, when people are still starting to learn a language. When you're in another country, you pick up the intonations of a voice, and during sarcastic sentences, during jokes, during angry phrases, during phrases when they express sadness, and you don't get this nuance in a classroom. So I think it's of vital importance a person go out to a country to learn the language, because you gain so much more from that. You gain almost like the language's formation itself, rather than just the grammatical structures. Having said that, I think I've seen, because in my degree, there were plenty of people who spoke Spanish and Portuguese. Obviously, they spoke it beautifully because they were from Spain or Portugal, and they were doing the degree to learn maybe literature or history or even linguistics, for instance. And they spoke the language beautifully. However, you gave them a grammar test and they would fall on the first hurdle, not because they were stupid, not because they didn't know the language, but because they didn't know it from a grammatical base at all. Now, when you learn a language from a grammatical base, what tends to happen, it becomes a lot easier. When you know it in such minute detail, it becomes a lot easier to adapt that and expand it to more general, easier terminology. And I find that if people might be fluent in a language, they could speak it to you in the most eloquent terms, but if they haven't learned the grammar, then they don't actually get a really detailed knowledge of the language. And I think when it comes to doing things that are more detailed, perhaps devising an intellectual speech, perhaps talking about things in a really analytical way, or even just improving your speech, you're improving the language yourself, gaining a more refined, more eloquent rhetoric. I think you do need to go in a bit more detail. I do think you need to take a grammatical approach. So my take on it is that we have, at least in the UK, half the system there. We have half the focus. So we do have the idea that you need to learn your grammar, you need to learn your verbs, or you're never going to form a sentence together, right? But at the same time, unless you're going to go to university level like I did, where it is mandatory for a person to do a year abroad in a country that speaks that language, or in my case, I split, so it was 6 months in Portugal, 6 months in Spain, then that's fine. You get that half there. In schooling, you get a couple of exchanges here and there. You get a couple of trips for a weekend in France or so, but you never get the other half, which is so vital in learning the language and in almost becoming the language and letting it really permeate your speech and your understanding and your brain and how you understand the other person's culture. You don't get that in a classroom. And that's where I think language learning can become difficult and it become very restricted.
Okay, let me pick up on that with my own experience learning Dutch, because when I studied forensic science in my undergraduates, I did that in the Netherlands, which a lot of German people do nowadays. And I'm going to be honest here and say before that day that I signed up for university, I've never seen Dutch. I've never heard Dutch. I've never even been to the Netherlands, which is quite shameful for my geographic location and you know,
you've got to go. Even I've been.
So I signed up for that pretty, well, I had no idea what I was in for, because the whole degree was in Dutch, and everything, the whole life obviously was in Dutch. And we got a course in Dutch, a crash course for German citizens. And it's obviously pretty easy for German to learn Dutch, because the languages are very, very similar. Yeah. But prior to that point, I failed horribly in French. I had to choose the different subjects. Otherwise, I would have probably failed my A levels, and I thought I was pretty horrible at languages. But the moment we walked into that crash course for Germans, they only spoke Dutch to us exclusively, and we obviously had a Dutch teacher. And it was so easy for me to learn the language. Of course, I did horrible mistakes. I still make horrible grammatical mistakes, especially.
Oh, so do I. Don't worry. It's really natural.
But I guess the thing that I'm saying is that I can really relate to that. They did try, however, to teach us all the grammatical stuff alongside, and they gave us one day, I remember they gave us a huge list, like 2,000 words that we should memorize, and I just took that list and threw it away. And I was just as good as anybody who did actually read the list. And it's my experience in German language teaching as well, is that they, at the very beginning, even when you're a small child, they start teaching you grammatical rules that you have to understand, and then they ask you questions about these rules in exam instead of letting you speak and acclimatizing in that environment. So would you agree to a statement such as you should start out just letting people speak, and as you get more advanced, you incorporate grammar and incorporate more technical knowledge?
I honestly, this is going to sound extremely overtly on the fence, so to speak. I think it depends on the individual, because some people might have self-confidence issues. And so when you thrust them in a situation when they speak very little Spanish, German, French, whichever language, you put them in a situation where they're just expected to speak, they might freeze up, they might freak out, they might get put off, and they might never want to speak that language again, because that could be quite a, I hate to say this term, but triggering experience for them.
No.
No.
Please, not triggering.
No, not that triggering. No, that's not triggering, obviously, but, you know, if someone doesn't have a base to even speak a language, they're not going to even benefit from the exchange of people, of people speaking their own language, and then they gain vocabulary, they gain grammar, etc. For instance, you know, I don't know Italian. When I went to Milan, I did pick it up, but there's no way I could have, you know, spoken anything in a fluent conversation without having learnt some prior, and obviously I didn't. That's not to say that, that's not to say I didn't really understand bits here and there, but what that does signify to me is that I think you do need a slight base. You don't need to be expert level, but I do think you need to kind of have the basic grammar, vocabulary, and verbs. And I do think that it gives you a bit of confidence going into another country, thinking, you know what, I might not be fluent, but I do know the basics. I can get directions, I can get food, I can go to a restaurant, I can, if I need to get a train ticket, I'm fine. I know the vocabulary for that. I know to ask a question for that. And gradually, step by step, as you are able to express a few more words, as you're able to pick up more vocabulary, you become better, you become more fluent, and your confidence grows. And as a result, you're much more eager to learn the language, to immerse yourself in the language even more so. So I do think I totally get that point. And I think it's, as I say, I think it's vital for someone to go into the other country to really, really appreciate and embrace the language. And I think you really get appreciation for language learning when you are put in that situation, for sure. But I do think that, if you don't have a base, you will struggle. And you might find you do, what many of my friends have done. and just when they won the year abroad and just never left their flat or home because they were just too scared to speak to a stranger because they didn't have the vocabulary in their itinerary. That's the opposite of what you want. You want to be a nice balance where you're confident enough to go out there and be able to show off your skills and show that you are capable of speaking the language, but also be able to pick up on the language of others. So you're able to have a fresh mind, like I said before, how young people tend to have fresher minds, have that young person's mindset of being ready to take in information, being ready to take in linguistic skills, being ready to improve your vocabulary, and therefore enjoying the experience as well as becoming a better linguist.
So you actually need both methods in parallel to help you learn the language, I guess. And it depends on the person, as you said. But I have a kind of more speculative question, and that is, do you think that learning in a grammatic system-oriented way of language can help you learn other languages later, because there are some repeating patterns in the languages, because the whole construct, as you've said, has some universal properties. So do you think it can actually help with other languages because you know the kind of patterns and how it's constructed?
Yes, 100%. I'm a huge believer in that. And I think that when you learn the grammar of one language, if it's like, for instance, my personal experience, when I learned Spanish, even though I did get confused with Portuguese in some cases because there are plenty of false friends, there are plenty of differences that might appear similar, but they're really not. But learning the verbs for Portuguese became an absolute breeze in terms of structure, in terms of endings, in terms of past tenses, because there are so many bloody tenses, but in terms of subjunctive, which is very alien to us in English because we don't really have a subjunctive mood. Subjunctive is essentially, it's not a tense, it's a mood. And it, obviously, you know this of people who speak languages, but for your listeners to clarify, subjunctive is sort of a mood that indicates something of a wish, desire, uncertainty, or in certain structures in perhaps Romance languages, for instance, or other languages. In English, it's much more subtle. It's more, it's if I were to say, if I were president, I would do this, or I might be free this evening, or, if I tidy my room tonight, we can go out. It's something that is, not certain. There's some sort of doubt there. It's almost hypothetical. It's a very vague sort of mood, and it's prevalent in languages like Portuguese, for instance. It's less common in Spanish. and Portuguese, they love to use their subjunctive, which is nightmare for a learner, but it does add richness to the language and the meaning, and it's beautiful. But because I've learnt all of those structures in Spanish, many of the verbs in Portuguese, albeit some very different ones, were very similar. So having learnt the grammatical structures and having learnt the discipline, even the discipline alone of going through vigorous lessons of grammar, made me more motivated and made me more committed and made me more focused when it came to learning Portuguese, for instance. So I think you are right on the money. I think learning grammar and learning a language itself will encourage you and also help you to learn other languages. Again, it's fascinating. And I wonder if that same connection, learning, say, a Romance language or Indo-European languages, linguistics or grammar can also be applied to, skill set wise to, say, learning German or, say, even learning Mandarin or something. I would say perhaps not the grammar, so to speak, literally, but certainly the discipline, certainly the structure, certainly the way you learn, will all improve the more languages you learn.
So I don't quite want to let you off the hook about the whole grammar and schools thing yet, because
no worries.
I slightly disagree.
I'm in the hot seat.
So the experience I had in school, again, especially with French, was pretty bitter, because you talked about the whole concept of having a base and being confident in that. The experience I had with language teaching in Germany in particular was that, yes, you got some of that base, but immediately with the first word, you already got a rule that you had to memorize, and you had to speak in very technical terms right at the beginning. So that threw me off completely. And if I recall correctly, there is actually a movement in Germany or an association who are working on putting together a new model for learning languages in school. And they start very much by mimicking the behavior a baby picks up certain sounds and languages. And they literally start with just listening to native speakers or at least content with native speakers in them, and trying then as a group to decipher certain words and then exchange words and go from there to build a base understanding, and then add on the grammar stuff later on once you have a half functional base. What do you think of that?
I think that's a very interesting take on it. And I think they're capitalizing, as I said, on, mimicking the way babies and young people learn languages. That won't necessarily work for someone, say, a 22-year-old student like myself, who will need probably more structure, probably need a greater expansion of understanding. I do think that, as we've discussed prior, languages and linguistics even can be almost a scientific form. And when you're learning science, unfortunately, it's not instinctive. You do have to learn the rules, you have to learn the facts, you have to learn reality, you have to use rationality. Now, the same thing, if we go by the allegory of languages being like science and linguistics being like science, should therefore be applied to grammar and the basics of grammar. So I think it honestly depends on, it sounds cheesy, but it does depend on the individual. But also, I do think it needs to be respected. As much as you respect scientific method and rigorous scientific theory, that same thing should be applied to grammar and linguistics. And I don't think that one can simply learn a language by just winging it. I think that language, it needs to be vigorously taught. I'm quite old school when it comes to this. I think you need to be consistent in it. When I was learning Spanish and Portuguese, I would be listening to a piece of news in Spanish every day, a piece of Portuguese and Portuguese every day. Even my phone right now is set to Portuguese because it helps kind of remind my brain of how the language is formed, of vocabulary, of little words here and there, set phrases. And I think much like going to the gym or riding a bike, it requires a lot of practice in order for you to fully get that grammatical structure ingrained. So as much as I agree with the idea of making a much more natural, much more hands-on approach to languages, and I think it's completely necessary. I don't think you can throw out the baby with the bathwater, and I think you need to respect the vigorous way of learning grammar, because it takes a while. I mean, even I make plenty of mistakes grammar-wise. And I mean, in speaking and when you're on the streets and such, it's not such a big deal. But in writing and reading, which is ultimately going to perform the core of your language skills, I think, when it comes to, say, essay writing or article writing, it's of vital importance that you really nail the process of learning that language. And I think that does take time. It takes dedication, and it takes a bit of scientific method in a lot of cases. I only really understood learning the grammar when I went beyond and I looked at the linguistics of the language and the history of the language. And that was fascinating for me academically speaking, but also it really benefited me as a language learner.
Okay. Yeah, I can see what you're saying, but I think, at least in the early years, right? My 8-year-old self would probably hate you if you make me read all those rules, right? But that's
so. What you do then, you would make it more fun. So, for instance, when I'm sure you had the same when you were learning English at a young age. You'd put on songs, you'd kind of do like role plays and pretend to be a shopkeeper or a restaurant owner. And just by doing when I was doing French, I knew ça va it was the constant interchange, but pretending to be a shopkeeper or something like that. I knew my brain would connect me pretending to be a shopkeeper, me saying ça va with how are you or something like that. And so stuff like that is great for young children. And I think that's so important. And you can kind of segue them in to the linguistics in a very fun, very jovial, very lighthearted way, through doing colorful cartoons. I remember when I was learning French, we had these books called Tricolore, and it was like this funny cat and a French flag shirt on, and he would be promoting grammar but in a really fun way, and you had to play games and dance and sing. So I completely get that, but that is still adhering to the rules of grammar. You're still teaching it, you're still getting the foundations of the language there, you're just doing it in a better way. Now we could ask whether we could use this way for adults, That would be an interesting way of looking at how to teach languages. I mean, some adults might be self-conscious about dancing in a circle or pretending to be a shopkeeper, but it's something to consider. You know, some people say to me, I can't learn language, I just can't get it. If they can't learn a list of vocabulary down, why don't they go to a film, or why don't they go to like a salsa dance festival or salsa class where the instructor might be speaking in Spanish or counting in Spanish? Now, when you're dancing or something like that, or when you're moving, again, it's kinetic movements. It's what you do when you're communicating with people. After all, 70% of our language is actually through our body. So you're connecting the words, you're connecting the concept, you're connecting the language with the way you're moving your body, right? So that is a very interesting way of learning a language. And so you could apply the funness that we do as a child to try and promote language learning. I mean, even the ABC, the alphabet, we sing songs when in our native language, right? You could apply that and make a more adult friendly version, so to speak, for the older people. And that in a way could definitely improve languages. That could be using that, method of kinetic learning. That could be harking back to times when you were younger and you were much more receptive to learning languages, but you would be molding it in a way that was much more appropriate for your age and appropriate for your hobbies and enjoyment. And I think that's key.
Getting back to teaching children and just babies the language, if I'm not mistaken, there is science on how crucial or how much cognitive development learning second and third language gives you, and just a cognitive improvement. Or do you think it's not necessarily a language? Is it something maybe similar to language learning that helps you improve cognitive abilities, or is it language?
I think actually, no, that's an excellent point. And I think, I definitely think that I actually saw studies, a recent study, and I can't remember which was, well, I'll try and find it and I'll link it so you guys can give to your listeners. But there was evidence to show that learning a second language kind of offers benefits, for memory improvement, for concentration, and even lowered risks of dementia and Alzheimer's. Now, whilst I'm skeptical about the last one, just because I don't think there's enough correlation to suggest that there is full improvement for it, I can certainly get on board with the former. Languages are complex, right? And speaking or learning a foreign language is essentially giving your brain a workout. And it sounds very base, it sounds very cheesy, but it's very true. When you're learning grammar, when you're learning how things form, when you're almost putting together a verbal jigsaw puzzle, you're working your brain, and you are improving cognitive function and your neural function as well. So I'm completely on board with that. And there's actually, and I think being bilingual as well will obviously improve your overall brain function. There's been a lot of research that's been done on this actually. And there's also studies that show that people, in correlation to this, tend to be better at planning, prioritizing, and decision making. Now, from personal experience, I can actually say that this is kind of true. From my own experience, as I was learning a language, I realized the importance of, say, organizing my verbal skills, from organizing my grammar, and actually, yes, decision making, because in a split second, you do have to kind of, if you're having a conversation with someone on the street, you can't just be thinking, what does that verb, what verb should I use there? I need my dictionary. Oh, what's this? It's very much a split second decision. You have to know what to say instinctively as if you're a native speaker. So I can see the correlation there. I can see where people connect that. And I definitely agree with that. And on a more practical level, learning a language takes a lot of discipline. It takes a lot of hard work. It takes time. So if you think about it that way, then you could argue, perhaps, you could go down the route that learning a language could, help improve self-discipline, work ethic, even give people encouragement to pursue long-term goals, because that is what a language is. You're pursuing something that is incredibly long-term. I mean, I'll still be learning Spanish, Portuguese, and even French, hopefully, and hopefully other languages for the rest of my life. It's something that is very long-term. And it's not something you can learn instantly. It takes time, it takes practice, it takes determination, because you're going to make so many mistakes. That is an excellent way of developing yourself as a person. So I can totally get on board with those studies when they suggest that it can improve overall cognitive function and brain function. No, I agree.
Okay, wonderful. One point I want to make about this is there seems to be a difference though for certain individuals in terms of motivation. For example, Yasha and I talked a bit about subvocalization and kind of what language goes on in your head. And I've been increasingly noticing that I start to think in English because most of my day is spent talking English. But when I go back to my experience with Dutch, that's not necessarily the case. I'm still somewhat more good. My Dutch friends will probably laugh at me, but I think I'm okay in Dutch. But a lot of my friends from Germany who I studied with and who have since left the Netherlands and didn't have such a strong connection to the country, and I mean, I'm going back there, so my connection is naturally stronger. But a lot of them already, even though we spent 4 years there, they already lost a lot of that stuff. So I think that's a very interesting point. Even though they spend so much time using it every day, it's already pretty much gone after a year.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to keep practicing your language, right? It get a bit rusty. It's almost like a muscle. You have to keep working at it. I'll tell you what I knew when I'd kind of clicked my languages, when I had my first dreams in Spanish and Portuguese. And it was so surreal listening to my English speaking family have Spanish voices and speaking in Spanish. And I woke up thinking, am I in a parallel universe? This is bizarre. And I get that completely. When you start thinking the language, that's when you really nailed it. And I think, as cliche as it sounds, that's when you know you've understood it on less of a superficial level and more on a more ingrained level. You can take on board the nuances and what someone is saying, the connotations of a sentence or a phrase, of cultural phrases that don't belong to your country per se. And I think that's when you clicked, and it's almost quite surreal because you're thinking, and bizarrely, and suddenly a phrase will come up to me in Spanish. And I think I'll never use that in English, but why is it here? And it's amazing. And I think that again, it's extremely rewarding. It's so rewarding. The best feeling when you know, oh wow, this language really is clicking with me. And I think that's unbeatable. I think that's amazing. And to know that you can, not only are you thinking that language, but now, because you're thinking in it, you have the potential to just go out there and have a conversation with someone and have a joke with someone and enjoy someone else's company that can speak a different language. I find that beautiful. You're connecting with someone. And we live in a very globalized world. And languages are a great way of connecting with people culturally, socially, and even emotionally. And I think people overlook this. Obviously linguistics is a beautiful science, but in the heart of it, language is truly about connection and communicating cultures that you might have not known before. So I think it's a really beautiful thing when you realize that this language has suddenly become a part of you.
But this global civilization is actually giving an argument for one global language, for example, English, because it's become lingua franca. But so if it's about most importantly connection and communication, then how do you argue against having one global language and putting other languages kind of aside?
Well, I think that would be, I don't think it would work because I think it would be unfeasible to have just one language. Now, it's not unfeasible to have very popular language based on the economy, based on businesses, based on the way some companies might work. That's completely fine. But the truth of the matter is, different countries will have different cultures, they'll have different ways of doing things, they'll have a different way of perceiving things. Now, that language preserves that. That language is able to portray it in a way that another language won't. Harking back to, say, when I was talking about saudade and Portuguese, no other language will be able to convey the same meaning as Portuguese will with that word saudade. So when it comes to, say a business meeting, someone might be talking about a certain thing that another person who might have learned the language a bit, and they might know what the word means, but they will never understand the cultural connotations with that. So I think having a one globalized language, I don't think it would work. And I think it would dilute real cultural meanings and cultural roots that countries have, that, they've shared and they've developed themselves. And that's almost, I'm going to say, I guess that's a form of kind of language supremacy, because each language has developed, historically speaking, through wars, through conquest, through their own development as a population. And if you just get rid of that language, you're getting rid of that history in my eyes. And I don't think that's right. That's not to say I don't think there should be, that that it's implausible or impossible or wrong to have more spoken language across the world. It's very natural because people are constantly moving, immigrating and working across the world. So it's inevitable that languages will mix, languages will change. And it's extremely fascinating as a linguist to watch this. But at the same time, I don't want a certain language to become extinct. So there are cases where people try and preserve very specific native languages, for instance, tribes in the Amazon jungle, for instance. I think that's a beautiful thing. I think that is a beautiful thing because that language contains so many cultural and historical roots that we, even if we understood the language, might not even understand. And that's fascinating. Now, with the language, you'll be able to connect that person. So that person can connect back to you and explain why that is important to them. And I think on a level that requires empathy, that requires social skills, that requires something that goes beyond science and reasoning in terms of linguistic fashion. So keeping just to one language, you'd miss out so many opportunities to connect with people and so many opportunities to connect not only on a more personal level, but on a business level. You'd be able to understand why people do things. You'd be able to understand why that company in Brazil might do something that company in Spain doesn't. And when you know this, you'll be able to know to go into a business meeting in a more professional manner, knowing what to say, because they know that they might appreciate this way of life or this way of speaking, etc. So I think it's vital that we keep languages together because you can understand why people think things and why people perceive things, which is, and at the end of the day, empathy is crucial in understanding others on a personal level and on a business level, in my eyes.
So let me whip out some armchair evolution here, even
Nice.
though I
Armchair evolution.
even though I successfully argued in a German class in my A levels, which was supposed to teach us the value of kind of preserving language, I successfully argued that is nonsense and we should have a global language. But my teacher then said, "Oh, Felix, you're correct, but we can't teach you that. The curriculum says something else."
Oh, really?
And then we moved on. But
that's ridiculous. Why? Well, I'd be really interested to hear why you think that one language would work. Or be the best way.
Let me actually tell you something that just came to me from an evolutionary perspective, which would probably undermine my whole argument I made at that time. Because if you think about it in the meme kind of sense, if you apply evolution to ideas, then, or even to the individuals who speak these languages, the moment everybody speaks one language and there's one person who invents a different language, with a friend, for example, they can communicate without anybody else understanding them, and then they can deceive the rest of the population and can gain an evolutionary advantage. So maybe from an evolutionary standpoint, it's simply impossible to have everybody speak the same language at all times.
That's a really interesting point of view. That's really, really interesting, actually.
I'm not really sold on this point because especially English language has shown how quickly and successfully it can evolve and pick up new words from other languages.
Well, can I just say, successfully, we've added the word twerk to the dictionary. That is not a success. That is going backwards. That is going backwards. So, just so you know.
Well, but arguably, English has evolved a lot, and it does. English have the most words used? I don't even know that.
Probably not.
No, well, the thing is, for instance, the word okay is actually one of the most spoken English words, I believe, in Spanish. I can't remember which. It's a language that isn't English, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's the most spoken word in a couple of languages that aren't even English. But it's okay. It's a very anglicized, Americanized even way of speaking. Okay, of affirmation. So that's really interesting how an English word has now permeated languages that aren't even English, but it's still the most commonly spoken word in that language. I find that really funny.
And even though the languages kind of culturally appropriate everything that comes to their path, you still have words that are exclusive to languages. And yes, you might get a dominant language, but in the same sense, you still have niche languages which pose a meme advantage in an evolutionary sense, I think.
But also in an evolutionary sense, I mean, you could go the full hog and you could argue that there are some regions of land, for instance, that might be densely covered in vegetation And so therefore you would need probably louder intonations of voice, probably more emphasis in vowels and consonants to get your voice across to avoid the echo of trees or such. So languages might have developed in that sense in an evolutionary standard so people can communicate in that sense. Now, you could argue, because in the Western world at least, we've kind of eradicated caves, we've become a mostly urbanized society, right? So do we perhaps need this the evolutionary developments of the language that we had in the past to survive and communicate with our tribes? Now, do we still need them? That's a very interesting point of view, and that could be one of the points, as well as various globalization points, why so many languages today are now becoming very anglicized. I mean, you go to Spain and Portugal, they'll say like they say Wi-Fi instead of Wi-Fi. Like they have very English words. Like a lot of Portuguese people say shit, like just to swear, like they just do. And there are a lot of English terminology and English phrases they still use, even though it's not part of their language. And so I find it interesting how English is becoming a dominant part of many non-English languages. Do I think that it will eradicate other languages? I really, really don't think so. And I'm glad, because I love learning languages, and I think it would be a real shame to lose languages, other languages. But I think it's extremely interesting to see how English forms such a great influence on the way non-English people speak, think, and communicate their ideas and concepts.
There was, I've seen recently that there was some isolated language in some small tribe where they didn't have the concept of right, left, up, down, but they always communicated the orientation in the sense of east, west, north, south. And there were some experiments that these people were much better at orientating in landscape and just in nature, but the English-speaking people were way better at going through labyrinths and some places where you have to know the place, the orientation, the direction that is relative to you and not globally. So I think it's fascinating how it actually, even just the language difference can affect how you think.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. Really is.
Well, listen, this hour went by so quickly. we might have to invite you again, but
oh, it's fine. I'd love to.
For now, where can people find other stuff and what from you, and what are your plans for the future?
So my future is going to be, in terms of career, I'm going to be running my own business on health and fitness, but in a very science and evidence-based way. Just going to try and make the industry great again, so to speak. But I'm also, as a passion, as a hobby of mine, I'm going to be fighting against censorship of free speech, fighting for science and reason, fighting for real justice and not social justice. And so you can find me on my Twitter at Sophie Tizzle. And I'll have various social media outlets there as well, which you can find me at. That will be my main port of call of communication for your listeners if they want to find me and contact me. And it was an absolute pleasure being on here. I mean, I love talking about language, and it's so nice talking about language. I mean, fine. I love talking about feminism and how, modern feminists are destroying everything. But you know what? It's so nice to talk about something different, and language is a huge passion of mine. So this was so enjoyable. So thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about it.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks. I think we've learned more in this hour than I've certainly learned in 4 years of French class.
Well, if you guys want to learn Spanish or Portuguese, just come to me. I can try and help you.
Okay then. Well, thanks for being on.
No, absolutely fine. Thank you so much.
Enjoyed the episode and want to make your voice heard? Head over to reddit.com/r/needlessly-complicated or chat with us on Twitter at reasonfelix for Felix or at Yasha for Yasha. If you want to support the show, head over to iTunes and rate, plus write us a review. It's the best way to support the podcast right now and help grow the community. You can also share the podcast with your friends via social media, or even better, if you're old school, in person. And with that, see you in our next episode.